Hello, and welcome back to Later Global Cultures. I'm Professor Amy Young, and today we're going to discuss the Age of Enlightenment. But before we begin, I need to ask, are we enlightened? What does being enlightened even look like? Does technology have anything to do with it? And in the end, does technology make us more or less woke? What does it even mean to be woke? This entire rabbit hole gets sticky if you really stop to think about it. Ever since the ancient philosophers started contemplating how things work and why we are the way we are, there have been theories on what it means to be enlightened. So, what do you think? Does being enlightened mean that you understand your position and purpose in the universe, in your society? Does it mean that you know all there is to know? Does it mean that you've explored the true nature of things, the true nature of humans? Does it mean that you no longer take things at face value, that you seek and find answers for yourself? Furthermore, can you be enlightened and still be religious? And what do you think enlightened means here in the 17th and 18th century? What do you suspect folks will need to figure out to be enlightened? There's a reason this is called the Age of Enlightenment and not the Age of the Enlightened. It's here that scientific exploration begins in earnest, and it's here that folks start to question what they've learned as the truth about their own nature and the nature of the universe from religion, politics, and society, from formal education, even. But then, and now, enlightenment is a process, and hopefully it's a never ending one. I think that more than one person would agree that then and now, wokeness and enlightenment depend upon constant questioning and constant striving for truth, reason, and understanding. See if you can tell how the folks we discuss today are working to discover those things for themselves and for others in the era. Today, in later global cultures, we'll work to understand the historical and philosophical context of the Age of Enlightenment. And we'll also explore the motivations and aims of Enlightenment thinkers as they break away from old models and forge a new path to what we in the future will ultimately take for granted. As I mentioned earlier, there's a reason this isn't called the Enlightened Age, and that's very much because it's just a beginning, the sort of coming of age of modern science and philosophy. In this era, they're challenging centuries old beliefs and developing a whole new way of looking at the universe. This is the first era wherein philosophy is seen as an independent discipline, finally separate from theology. It can address secular concerns. And as such, it seeks to explain things via objective demonstration rather than abstract generalization. Philosophers and scientists opt for inductive and deductive reasoning instead of supernatural explanations, emphasizing the importance of objective truth, objectively demonstrated. This sort of logic and reason are at the heart of the scientific method in modern philosophy today. But you have to keep in mind that in an era that had been steeped in religious explanation for a millennia, this is a novel departure using reason to arrive at truth. What do you suppose are the consequences of this new way of thinking, philosophically or socially? Well, the turn away from religious explanation results in a sort of crisis of European conscience. See, they believed in God, but new science sometimes opposed faith using reason. It also challenged dogma with skepticism and countered divine intervention with natural law. Can you think of any way for them to reconcile this? Many can't, and others find interesting new ways of looking at religion to bridge the gap. Plus, religion's going on the back burner isn't just bad for the church, it also challenges the divine right of kings, so people are rethinking society and politics too. All of this actually starts in the 1600s, which you'll remember as the Baroque era, and it starts with Sir Francis Bacon and the empirical method. Empiricism, like Aristotle's thinking, is using real world ideas and real world proofs. Francis Bacon was an English scientist, a philosopher, and an intellectual, and he introduced the empirical method of understanding. You may recognize it today as the scientific method. Regardless, it's a method of understanding in which theories must be tested and observed before they may become proofs or facts. Bacon did this via inductive reasoning. With inductive reasoning, a theory must be backed up by data. In fact, data comes first, so no cherry picking data to prove theoretical conclusions. With this method, scientists could best understand nature, and data was superior, Bacon argues, because a reliance on our human senses alone often results in error. Not only that, but according to Bacon, we must. Not only that, but according to Bacon, we must not rely upon old, worn out idols or ideas that have been put on pedestals, those that for so long have been called human nature. Bacon hones in on these as he points out four idols that are particularly troublesome. First, there are the idols of the tribe, which is what he calls the fact that humans trust their senses at all. He derides this as the erroneous belief in the superiority of human perception. Then there's the idols of the cave. This is the reliance upon education, upbringing, or religion, or really whatever people have used to shelter and excuse themselves from reason. These are the things that imbue individuals with a false sense of superiority, placing themselves above other humans despite the fact that all humans are flawed. There are also idols of the marketplace. For Bacon, these are errors of communication. He explains further that this is the use of words or communications that hide within them false assumptions. For instance, if you see something using the word mankind, this word comes with a false assumption. It's one that asserts that men, in particular, are superior. Then lastly, Bacon mentions the idols of the theater. These are all of the false dogmas and maxims that have come before, and it even includes those that are yet to be composed. Basically, it's anything spouted as truth without proof, and for him, this includes religion. So what do you think? Is there a theme here? For Bacon, truth must be objective, and moreover, it must be empirically demonstrated. Queen Elizabeth didn't love Bacon, but King James did, and he rose up high in political office. Eventually, though, he was charged with bribery, which may have been more of a political frame job because of issues between Parliament and the king. And after he was kicked out of public office, he returned to science. So, I don't know, maybe he had some personal interest in his search for objective truth. Also in the 1600s is someone who is perhaps slightly more famous than Bacon, Galileo Galilei. Galileo was an Italian, and he was into astronomy and physics. In his time, he used experimentation and observation, the sort that Bacon suggests, and he used it to prove astrophysiological theories, which is no small feat considering the technical limitations of the time. Galileo is most famous for his support of heliocentrism, or the idea that the sun is the center of our galaxy. It's important to note that centuries before, Copernicus suggested a sun-centered universe, but he hadn't proved it. Recent inventions, the telescope and the microscope, helped Galileo build upon Copernicus's ideas. In fact, Galileo improved upon the telescope and eventually proved Copernicus right. See, the other theory, the geocentric theory, was a belief held since classical Greece, so around the 2nd century. Geocentrists believed that the sun, moon, and planets all revolved around the Earth. Furthermore, they thought that the Earth didn't move, and with this theory, the Earth was not considered a planet either. The Church also liked this theory because it backed their assertion that the Earth was the crowning creation of God and that humanity and the Earth were the center of God's handiwork. For his assertions, Galileo was charged with heresy by the Church. You remember, this was Inquisition time, so this is not a small charge. To avoid death, Galileo was forced to recant his theories, and even after he did that, he was sentenced to life in prison. Eventually, some powerful friends got his sentence commuted to house arrest, which was not too bad considering others charged with the same things were burned at the stake. Galileo didn't spend his time sulking, though. While on house arrest, he started to work on physics. He worked on theories of motion and used terrestrial math to disprove Aristotle's theory that objects stayed in motion because of the pushing motion of the air. Galileo suggested instead that mass that is moving will go on moving until some force stops it. This is, if you did not know, the earliest expression of the modern law of inertia. So yeah, Galileo's a pretty impressive guy. Incidentally, the Catholic Church opposed the heliocentric worldview until 1822. That's right, 1822. Then, in the 1980s, the Pope reopened Galileo's case to give him a fair trial. As a result, he was acquitted of heresy charges more than 200 years after his death. Another important figure is Rene Descartes. He's so important that he's known as the father of modern philosophy. Descartes is French, but he lived in Holland for nearly 20 years. And though he was religious in his studies, he found traditional theological teachings unsatisfactory, so he searched for reliable evidence of truth. To get at this, he stressed deductive reasoning. Unlike inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning starts with broad statements and works its way through the evidence to logically prove or disprove those statements. So where inductive reasoning first looks at small facts and reasons from those logical proof of big ideas, deductive reasoning goes from big ideas to small facts that prove those big ideas. Make sense? Well, with this form of reasoning, Descartes established a criteria for defining reality. To do this, he began with the big idea of universal doubt. He actually started by doubting everything he knew, including whether or not he actually existed. So he was kind of like people today who posit that we're living in a simulation. From there, he worked his way through his senses, doubting that any of those things could be trusted. He eventually determines cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Thought, he figured, was the only identifiable proof that he existed as a conscious being. And this phrase, this proof, was the starting point of his worldview, that the most important truths are arrived at via the intellect. He further used this theory to question traditional teachings as secondhand, i.e., doubtful, information, and he even used his universal doubt to theorize about the existence of God. If you get a chance, read his Discourse on Method for more on how he utilizes a new brand of rational humanism. And Descartes wasn't the only notable French thinker. Actually, there were a good number of them in France. They called themselves the philosophes, or the philosophers. Born of French salons, the philosophes prospered after Louis XV, and as a group, they wanted to understand and improve existence. The group considered all sorts of topics, including arts and their criticism. Plus, most of them were deists, so that helped them balance religion and logical thinking. To them, God is reason and logic. To better describe this, they compared the world and all life to a great clock. Basically, God put the clock into motion, but afterwards he didn't mess with it. Instead, he put in place all of the natural laws, all of the physics and biology it needed to run itself. So, to these folks, the Bible was mythology, not the rationally revealed truth of God, and instead they emphasized the rational powers of humanity. And they wanted to offer this knowledge to the world, so they got together to create the Encyclopédia. Denis Diderot was the work's editor, and he was himself active in Salon society, sharing the ideas recorded in the Encyclopédia. Altogether, the Encyclopédia was made up of 35 volumes, 200 contributors, and 72,000 entries. Voltaire was even one of the contributors to this work, and in its day, it was the largest compendium of knowledge in the West. Its creators pretty much wanted to collect and catalog everything. The publication itself was funded by subscribers, so no publishers or rulers had any stake or say in it. And Louis XV hated it. He claimed it was damaging the public's morality. In reality, though, he was probably just pissed that it empowered the people and made them question the authority of the monarchy. So overall, these thinkers were proponents of rational humanism. This is the belief that humanity can do great things, and it has nothing to do with God. Rather, it had to do with humanity's ability to reason. These guys, and other great minds of the day, desired to dispel human ignorance. To them, progress and enlightenment were inevitable. What do you think? Were they right? And there was even a philosophical exploration of politics in this age, most notably the exploration of the concept of the social contract by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Hobbes and Locke were both witness to the English Civil War, and this no doubt influenced their very different views. If you don't know, the English Civil War was a battle between folks fighting for a republic, or the parliamentarians, and people defending the monarchy, or the royalists. What sort of things do you think influenced folks to choose one side or another? Well, conservative Protestants favored Parliament, mostly because the monarchs, then the Stuart dynasty, were messing with religion. In fact, Charles I married a Catholic, and then he proposed changes to the church liturgy. This was mostly a problem because his changes made the Anglican Church a whole lot more Catholic looking. Then, to make matters worse, he got rid of Parliament, which helped govern up to that point, and made himself an absolute ruler. This resulted in a lot of fighting, in which Charles I was executed and Charles II was exiled. With their removal, the Commonwealth of England was established under Cromwell. But even then, it's not too pretty. Cromwell was nicknamed Old Ironsides for his wherewithal in battle, and he passed laws against Catholicism, which made him no friends in Ireland or Scotland, where Catholicism was still a big deal. Plus, he was pretty dang strict. He also lost some fans amongst the parliamentarians, even. All of this leads up to a pendulum shift. When Cromwell dies and the royalists take over again, they were also uncool. They dragged out Cromwell's dead body, put it in chains, hung it, and beheaded it to mark their takeover. With the royalists in charge, Charles II is brought back from exile and made king. But they compromise by adding provisions for Parliament to have a say in who gets to rule. The result is a parliamentary monarchy, which was set up in 1660, and it's still how England runs things today. So, as I mentioned, Locke and Hobbes saw all of this, and it most definitely was some of the inspiration for their writings. In essence, they were both trying to order the chaos of the government in their time. Hobbes was a royalist, and in his work Leviathan, he asserts that humanity is a hot mess. He claims that humanity is inherently bad and can't take care of itself, and that, left to its own devices, it would find only a solitary, brutish life of misery. The only thing that can motivate humans to behave, according to Hobbes, is a fear of death or a fear of power, or both. And because of this, humans agree to follow strong rulers who can protect against war and chaos. So in this case, someone who does not waver or share his or her rule offers security, and in return, the people fall in line, thereby acting according to a de facto social contract to honor absolutionism, this being the only thing that can keep their inherently bad nature in check. Locke, however, has different ideas about human nature, the rights of man, and what sort of government is best suited for those natures and rights. He was a parliamentarian, and he refuted the divine right of kings. Furthermore, Locke asserted that rather than being inherently bad, humans are a product of their environment. They're a blank slate or a tabula rasa waiting to be filled, and if their environment is good, they'll be good too. He believed that humans were entitled to life, liberty, and property, and that they were naturally equal, free, and capable, especially as they were able to reason. Now, all of this sounds good, right? Can you see any issues with it? Look at this time frame. Who was really entitled to these rights? Well, at least some were entitled, and government, Locke claimed, was only there to protect the rights of its citizens. To get this done, he advocated for a government by the people, a government wherein human beings contract together to protect God-given rights. Furthermore, in this social contract, government needed to be kept in check. If the government gets too absolutionist or gets too big for its britches, the people have an obligation to overthrow it. Liberty must prevail. And with this, he gives us liberalism. Does this sound familiar? Yep, it was the inspiration for the French and American revolutionaries, and it became a hallmark of the values and beliefs in both of those countries. Be sure to check out some of the writings of Hobbes and Locke to get a better idea how they each rationalized their positions. And last but not least, there was some literature that reflected these aims too. The epic poetry of John Milton also reflects some of the tumult of the English Civil War, as well as some of the struggles between rational thought and religion in this era. An epic, in case you aren't familiar, is a long narrative poem that often features a heroic tale, a historic tale, or a mythical tale. But most importantly, epics artistically outline the values and beliefs of their era. Milton wrote his most famous epic, Paradise Lost, after he'd gone blind, and he too was a witness to the English Civil War. He was a Cromwell supporter, and he fought alongside Cromwell. Paradise Lost starts with the invocation of the Muses, sort of Milton's shout out to the ancient epics that were his inspiration, and it tells the story of the fall of man, the Garden of Eden, as well as the temptation and the expulsion. Generally, it's a vision of the world locked in a struggle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. Or, as Milton tells it, it's a story meant to, quote, justify the ways of God to men. But it may also be a sort of diary of Milton's own thoughts on government and society. He was a parliamentarian, he was a Puritan, and he saw George beheaded, but his party was eventually booted and he had to reconcile his prior convictions with his current reality. Paradise Lost is very likely a commentary on that loss. The actions of Satan and man in the tale could be Milton justifying his actions or Cromwell's actions. And the victory of God and Jesus could be Milton coming to terms with the team that won out in the end. In the epic, he also addresses free will and liberty. In the biblical tales, as well as in the epic, God knew what was going to happen, but he didn't intervene. He left the choice up to man. God knew that creating puppets on strings would be pointless, and free will is necessary for humanity to properly operate. Indeed, no relationship would be sincere if it was forced to exist. And this reflects Milton's views on government, too. What's perhaps most interesting, though, is the picture he paints of Satan or Lucifer. In this tale, Lucifer is the liberal, the freedom fighter, the smooth talker, and Milton's depiction is sometimes seen to glamorize evil. Satan is ambitious and deceitful. He's charming, and he never gives up on his struggles against all odds. In the epic, he's described as having a shield as big as a moon and a sword as big as a Norwegian pine. And when rebelling against God, he's the only one willing to take a risk and cross the abyss. It doesn't last, though. Lucifer gets uglier and uglier the more vengeful he gets, so kind of like Cromwell. But ultimately, he still exemplifies ideas of freedom as he states, quote, it's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. In the end, Adam is redeemed when he accepts Jesus as Lord. So here the poem emphasizes free will, but also advocates for taking responsibility for one's own actions. And really, that's kind of what Milton is doing with his poem, too. As he notes in the epic, quote, the mind can make a hell of heaven and a heaven of hell. And with that, we'll wrap up the Age of Enlightenment. There are many more influential thinkers in this age that I just don't have time to mention, but hopefully this taste of how they're looking at things from a different angle gives you a glimpse of how things will be changing and changing fast in the coming eras. Until next time.